Charlotte Hayes arrived at Blackwood Manor just before dusk, the autumn sky bruised with streaks of purple and gray. The house loomed over her, its once white trim now peeling, its iron gate rusted and crooked. She barely remembered her great-aunt Eleanor, just a hazy childhood memory of a frail woman who smelled of lavender and dust. And yet, the old woman had left her everything. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, Charlotte stepped inside. The air was thick with age, the scent of forgotten things pressing against her lungs. The grand staircase stood before her, winding up into the dimness, but what caught her attention first were the puppets. Dozens of them. They lined the walls on narrow wooden shelves, their painted faces frozen in twisted smiles and sorrowful frowns. Some were porcelain, others made of carved wood, their glassy eyes catching the fading light from the chandelier above. Some wore miniature suits, others frilly Victorian dresses, their tiny hands resting in their laps as if waiting. Charlotte swallowed hard, unease prickling at the back of her neck. The house had been left untouched for years, dust covering every surface, except for them. The puppets looked clean, their clothes neatly pressed. She forced herself to ignore them as she explored the house, noting the towering bookshelves, the ornate fireplace, the flickering bulbs that cast long, uneasy shadows. She found the bedroom she'd be staying in, an old four-poster bed with heavy curtains. The house creaked and settled around her as night fell, the wind moaning against the windows. Sleep came in fits. Somewhere in the house, something moved. A soft tap, 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 like fingers drumming against wood. Charlotte stirred but didn't wake fully. The sound came again, closer this time, then silence. When she finally opened her eyes, the room was still. But something was wrong. One of the puppets had fallen from the shelf across the room. It lay on the floor, its porcelain face cracked just slightly at the corner of its mouth. Its head was twisted toward her. And though she knew it had been smiling before, it wasn't smiling now. Charlotte sat up in bed, her heart pounding against her ribs. The puppet lay motionless on the wooden floor, its cracked mouth slightly open, as if whispering something it couldn't quite say. She told herself it must have fallen on its own. Houses this old shifted, floorboards creaked, things tumbled from shelves. But as she knelt to pick it up, a cold unease settled over her. It was heavier than she expected, its limbs stiff, its tiny hands curled as if they had once grasped something. The painted eyes, framed by delicate lashes, seemed deeper now, darker. She quickly placed it back on the shelf, facing forward like the others, and crawled back into bed. She didn't sleep. The next morning, Charlotte tried to shake the eerie feeling. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, making the house feel less oppressive. She spent the day exploring, checking the library, the attic, the locked study. In the master bedroom, she found an old trunk filled with yellow dresses and brittle letters written in careful cursive. But what unsettled her most was the small wooden box resting beneath them. Inside were glass eyes, pairs of them, staring blankly up at her, some blue, some brown, one even milky white, cracked and useless. She slammed the box shut, her breath quickening. Maybe her great-aunt had been a collector. Maybe it was just another oddity among the dozens she had already found. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the old house's bones. Charlotte pulled the thick covers over herself, determined to sleep. Then came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. Software light, like tiny feet against wood. She held her breath, her body stiff. It was coming from the hallway. Charlotte reached for her phone, the dim glow of the screen casting long shadows across the room. The sound stopped. Silence stretched. Slowly she turned toward the shelf where the puppet sat. One was missing. A chill ran down her spine as she scanned the room, her breath coming faster now. Then she saw it, near the foot of her bed, sitting upright, facing her. Her blood ran cold as she realized something even worse. Its head was tilted slightly as if it were looking at her, and its lips, which had been cracked open the night before, were now closed. Charlotte couldn't breathe. Her gaze was locked on the puppet sitting at the foot of her bed, its painted eyes glistening in the dim light. She could have sworn that moments ago it hadn't been there. She had checked. She had locked eyes with every single puppet when she turned off the light. But now, it was there. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, the screen casting an eerie glow. The puppet's features were so lifelike, so unsettlingly detailed. She squinted as though trying to convince herself that it was simply a trick of the light. She'd been tired. Maybe she had just missed it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed again, sharp and distinct, followed by the faintest whisper of movement. Charlotte froze, holding her breath. The puppet's glassy eyes didn't move, but the silence felt thick, as if the house itself were holding its breath too. With a swift motion, she grabbed the puppet and placed it back on the shelf, trying to convince herself it was all just a figment of her imagination. But when she turned back to her bed, the heavy weight of dread settled over her. There was a palpable sense of being watched. Charlotte shoved the feeling down and pulled the covers tighter around her. Her heart drummed in her chest, each beat feeling louder than the last. She tried to fall asleep, telling herself that it was just an old house playing tricks on her, settling sounds, shifting walls. But then, as she lay there in the dark, the silence became unbearable. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that the room was full of unseen eyes. She had to check. She couldn't fight the urge to look. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The puppet that had been on the shelf was now sitting in the corner of the room, a few feet away from her bed. Charlotte's heart leapt in her throat. No. She hadn't moved it. She was sure she hadn't. And yet, there it was, sitting, its head slightly tilted toward her, staring, watching. Her breath came faster, her chest tightening as she scanned the other shelves. The puppets had all shifted. They were no longer neatly aligned. Several had moved closer to the edge of the shelf, their eyes still locked on her. The puppet in the corner didn't just sit there. It was now closer, its small wooden feet pointed toward her, its arms stiff and posed as if it had been placed intentionally, purposefully. Charlotte's fingers shook as she reached for the lamp. The room lit up in harsh fluorescent light. The puppets were, as they always had been, frozen, lifeless. They stared forward, unmoving, their expressions unchanged. But something wasn't right. She had seen them move. She shut her eyes, a wave of nausea crashing over her. Then, from the corner of the room, she heard it. Soft whispers. Not from the puppets, no. This sound came from the walls. It was faint, like breathing, low and insistent. Charlotte's stomach churned. The puppets. They weren't just staring at her. They were waiting, watching, waiting for something. She scrambled out of bed and rushed to the door, but as she turned the handle, she froze. The hallway was pitch dark. The house was silent again. But something was different. The air had changed, thickened, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. Before she could move, the tap, tap, tap came again. This time, it was all around her. The puppets. They were moving. Charlotte slammed the door shut, her heart racing as she backed into the room, eyes darting around in panic. The tapping echoed in the walls, growing louder, then softer, as if the sound was circling her. She pressed her back against the door, hands shaking. She could almost hear the puppets whispering, though their mouths never moved. Number. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let the fear swallow her. She needed to understand what was happening. She stumbled across the room to the dusty bookshelf, pulling down books and papers, desperate for anything that might explain the madness. The room seemed to be growing colder, the very air growing thick with something she couldn't name. And then she found it. Buried beneath stacks of old letters was a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was elegant but erratic, frantic at times, as though the writer was desperately trying to put their thoughts onto paper before it was too late. The first entry was dated nearly 30 years ago. I should never have made them. Charlotte felt a chill creep up her spine as she read further. They are not dolls, they are vessels. The first ones I created, they were supposed to protect the house, to keep the evil away. But now they are the evil. They move when they are seen, and they are always watching. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she turned the page. If you read this, you've already begun to notice them. And if you notice them, they will notice you. They feed on your attention. The more you look, the more they move. She slammed the journal shut, her breath coming fast. It couldn't be real. This was crazy. But then the tapping returned. It was louder this time, closer. It was in the room with her. Her eyes darted to the shelves, and she saw it. The puppet she had placed back on the shelf had moved again. It was sitting on the floor just a few feet away from her. She backed away, a strangled gasp escaping her throat. The words from the journal haunted her. Never look too long, never speak to them, never count them. Charlotte felt the overwhelming pull to look, to count them. She fought it, but the urge was growing stronger, like an invisible hand pushing her toward the shelves. Reluctantly, she glanced at them. There were more than she remembered. She could have sworn there had been fewer just hours ago. Several new faces had appeared, their empty eyes staring back at her. Her head spun as she tried to make sense of it. How many had been there when she first arrived? Her breath quickened. She had no idea. Then something in the journal caught her eye again. They will never stop coming. They will never leave. Once you're marked, there is no escape. They will keep you here. The only way to stop them is to leave, but you cannot leave. They will follow you. She felt sick, the walls closing in. The room was spinning. Something moved in the darkness. Charlotte whipped her head around toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. But when she looked at the puppet on the floor again, its head was no longer facing her. It had turned away, toward the door. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest, a raw, frantic rhythm. She could feel the air in the room thickening, as though the house itself were alive and pressing in on her, suffocating her with its silence. The puppet on the floor had moved again. Its head was now turned away, facing the door as if it were waiting for something, or someone. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the fact that it was no longer where she had left it, or the overwhelming feeling that the house was somehow alive, watching her every move. Her eyes flicked to the other puppets. They were closer. Some were practically leaning over the edges of the shelves, their glass eyes trained on her, following her every motion. Every time she glanced away, they seemed to inch forward, closer to the edge of the shelf. It was as if they were waiting for her to blink, to make the mistake of not paying attention. The journal's warnings echoed in her mind. Never count them. Never look too long. But it was too late. She couldn't stop herself from counting. She had to know. She had to see. 1, 2, 3. The faces blurred together as she scanned the shelves. No matter how hard she tried to focus, the number kept changing. A new face would appear where there hadn't been one before, and another would disappear into the shadows, as though it was never there at all. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed, as if the house was spinning faster than her mind could keep up. 4, 5, 6. Charlotte stumbled backward, her feet colliding with something soft. She spun around, her breath sharp in her throat, and realized she had backed into the bed. The bed, the one where she had felt safest just hours ago. Her eyes went back to the puppets. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The tapping returned, but it wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from the puppets. The sound was rhythmic, a soft, deliberate tapping of wooden fingers against the shelves, followed by a quiet rustling like something was shifting. A gasp tore from Charlotte's lips as she looked around the room, unable to find the source of the noise. The puppets were moving, not just the one on the floor anymore. The entire room felt like it was alive, like the walls were closing in, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The shadows seemed deeper now, darker, pressing closer. Then there was another sound. A creak. One of the puppets, the one that had been facing the door, stood up. Charlotte's body went cold. The puppet took a step forward, its stiff limbs jerking as if it was struggling to move. Then another step, and another. The others followed, rising from their shelves, one by one, as if they were coming to life. Charlotte froze, her eyes wide, unable to move, unable to breathe. The puppets had all started to walk toward her, their stiff bodies creaking with each step, their glass eyes locked on her. The journal's words played in her mind again. Once they begin to move, you will never be safe again. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. She could feel them getting closer, hear the soft squeak of their wooden joints, the faint tapping of their fingers. The walls seemed to shudder, the house groaning as if it too were preparing for something horrible. Then, in a moment of clarity, Charlotte realized something. They weren't moving toward her. They were moving toward the door. With sudden horror, Charlotte glanced over her shoulder. The door, the only escape, was wide open, as though someone had already left it ajar. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, cold and dark. The puppets were walking out of the room. They were heading for the door, and Charlotte was trapped. Charlotte's body went numb, her mind racing as she watched the puppets move toward the open door. Their slow, jerky movements were like something out of a nightmare, their limbs stiff and unnatural, yet purposeful. She had no time to think, no time to reason. All she knew was that the door, her only way out, was wide open, and they were leaving. She didn't hesitate. Without thinking, she bolted toward the door, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't let them get out. If they left the room, they would follow her. They would track her down, move when she wasn't looking, always getting closer. But just as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls, leaving her breathless. Charlotte stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her throat, panic seizing her chest. Her heart pounded so loudly that it seemed to drown out the sound of the creaking floorboards, the soft tap, tap, tap of tiny wooden feet. The puppets. They were inside the room. They had turned around, their glass eyes fixed on her once more, their stiff limbs now poised, as if waiting for something. The air was thick, choking, like the room itself was closing in on her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare into their lifeless eyes, paralyzed by the growing sense of dread. And then, one of them moved. The puppet closest to her stepped forward, its tiny feet making a soft click against the wooden floor. The others followed suit, each one taking a deliberate step closer to her. Charlotte felt her legs weaken beneath her. She stumbled backward, but the room was too small, too tight. She was trapped. Her mind raced. The journal. There had to be something in the journal, anything that could explain what was happening. She reached down, desperate, and grabbed the small leather-bound book, flipping through its pages with frantic hands. Charlotte's hands were shaking violently as she flicked through the journal, desperate to find any hint of a way out. The pages felt like they were slipping through her fingers, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her had thickened even more, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft sound of the puppet's feet tapping against the floor as they moved closer. Her eyes scanned the pages wildly. She had to find something, anything that could help her. And then, as if guided by some invisible force, her fingers stopped on a page that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The words on it were faded, almost illegible, but Charlotte could make out enough to understand what it said. The end begins when they have you in their gaze. Her throat went dry. The words felt like a warning, like an omen of what was to come. She felt the puppets getting closer, felt the weight of their eyes on her, their gaze so intense it burned into her skin. She could barely breathe under the pressure. They will never stop. They will never leave you. They are the house, and the house is them. You are one with the house now. There is no escape. Charlotte's mind raced, her thoughts colliding with each other in a chaotic frenzy. Number. No, this couldn't be true. She had to be able to escape. But the words were sinking into her mind like poison, and with each passing second, she could feel the truth of them wrapping around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. The house had claimed her. The puppets weren't just creatures of wood and fabric. They were something far more sinister. They were alive, and once they had their sights on you, there was no turning back. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. The puppets were almost upon her now, their feet moving in unison, their stiff bodies creaking with each step. Charlotte stumbled backward, her mind going blank as panic set in. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her legs wouldn't move. It was like the room was pressing in on her from all sides, holding her in place. She reached out to the wall for support, but it felt wrong, alive, like the house itself was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. And then, one of the puppets reached out a hand. It was a small, delicate hand, made of smooth wood, but the movement was deliberate, almost human. Charlotte froze as the tiny fingers brushed her arm, sending a cold chill through her veins. The touch was so light, so gentle, yet it felt like it was cutting through her skin. The room grew even darker. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, the air heavy with the scent of decay. She could hear the soft whispers again, voices low and raspy, just out of reach. They were talking to each other, but she couldn't understand what they were saying. "You're one of us now." The words cut through the air like a knife, and Charlotte spun around, her wide eyes searching for the source. There, in the corner of the room, was an old mirror she hadn't noticed before. It was cracked, the glass fractured in a jagged pattern. But what caught her eye wasn't the reflection. It was the shadowy figure standing behind her in the glass. A puppet she didn't remember seeing before. It had no eyes, just empty sockets where eyes should have been. Charlotte screamed. The room was spinning now, the shadows closing in, the puppet's wooden feet tapping faster, growing louder. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew it was pointless. There was no way out. The mirror reflected her, but it wasn't her. The reflection was twisted, distorted, her face warped in fear. She saw herself, but the image was wrong. Her eyes were dull, lifeless, like a puppet's eyes. And then, with a sudden sharp crack, the glass shattered. A cold hand gripped her shoulder. Charlotte spun around, but no one was there. The puppets had stopped moving. They were watching her, waiting. She could feel them inside her mind. She could hear their whispers now, louder and clearer, their voices coming from every corner of the room. They were calling to her, beckoning her, pulling her toward them. And in that moment, Charlotte understood. The house had won. She was no longer just Charlotte Hayes. She was part of the house now, part of the puppets, and there was no escaping them. As the last flicker of light faded from the room, she felt herself fall into the dark. The whispers grew louder, their voices mingling with her own. She had become one of them, just another puppet in the endless, lifeless procession. And the house had claimed her forever. The room had gone silent, the whispers now nothing more than a faint murmur in the distance. Charlotte's body felt numb, as if she were floating outside herself. Her hands, once trembling in fear, now lay perfectly still at her sides. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, mechanical breaths, each inhale and exhale an effort, yet somehow detached. The puppets were still standing there, their lifeless eyes locked onto her, watching her as if waiting for something. They hadn't moved, not even a twitch of their wooden limbs. But Charlotte felt it now, the presence of them, the pull of their gaze. as if they were feeding on her, becoming a part of her. It wasn't a physical sensation. It was deeper. Her mind, her very essence was beginning to fade into the endless hollow they inhabited. The house was consuming her, pulling her into its dark heart, and she couldn't fight it anymore. She wasn't even sure if she wanted to. She turned her head, her movements slow and jerky, like one of them. Her gaze met the cracked mirror again, and she was struck with a horrible realization. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her. It was a puppet now. Her face was frozen in a hollow stare, her eyes wide but dull, like two empty sockets. Her hair was flat against her face, lifeless, and her skin pale, almost waxy. The details were blurry, distorted, as if her reflection wasn't her at all. Something shifted behind her. A sound, a low creak, echoed through the room. The puppets had moved. One by one, they had begun to shift positions. But this time, it wasn't slow. It wasn't jerky like before. They moved with purpose, and they were no longer on the shelves, no longer standing still. They were circling her, surrounding her. Charlotte wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body refused to obey her. She was still standing, still breathing, but she wasn't in control anymore. It was as if the house, the puppets, had taken over her very soul. Then, one of the puppets, the one without eyes, stepped forward. It reached out with its hand, the smooth wood of its fingers gently brushing against her face. The coldness of its touch sank deep into her skin, a sensation she couldn't escape. She couldn't feel anything but the emptiness that seemed to grow within her. She was no longer Charlotte. She was one of them. The puppet's face twisted, its features stretching, distorting into something grotesque, something unholy. Its mouth, if you could even call it a mouth, opened, and a voice, not quite human, came through. Welcome. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It was hollow, distorted, like an echo from the deepest corners of her mind. It felt like it was coming from her own mouth, but Charlotte knew. She wasn't the one speaking. Her limbs twitched, her head jerking to one side as the puppet's fingers moved to her neck. She felt them tighten, not in pain, but in possession. It was like her body was becoming a marionette, strings pulling her in ways she couldn't control. She could feel her essence being drawn out, like a final gasp, a final surrender to the house, to the puppets, to whatever twisted force ruled this place. And then, it was over. Her mind was silent. Her thoughts had disappeared into the dark corners of the room, replaced by a single, unified consciousness. The puppets were no longer just mindless creatures of wood and fabric. They were part of her now. She was part of them. Charlotte's reflection in the mirror was gone, replaced by something else. A puppet with hollow eyes, a lifeless smile, and a body frozen in place, waiting for the next movement. She was no longer the woman who had entered the mansion. She was something far worse. She was one of the souls the house had claimed. And as she turned to face the other puppets, she understood. The cycle would never end. There would always be a new victim, a new soul to claim, a new puppet to add to the collection. Charlotte was now a part of the house, forever. Charlotte stood among the puppets, her movements now as stiff and unnatural as theirs. She could feel the strings inside her, pulling her limbs, guiding her actions. Her mind was a quiet observer to the chaos unfolding around her. The house had swallowed her, and with it, her sense of self. The other puppets had gathered in a circle, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light. The air felt colder now, heavier, as though something final was about to happen. The house had claimed its prize, and she was now just another soul trapped in its walls. But there was a part of her, small, distant, that wanted to fight, to scream, to break free from this nightmare. The puppets began to move again, their stiff limbs creaking, their wooden feet tapping against the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was a dance, a macabre waltz of death. Charlotte could feel her own body responding, her feet moving without her command, falling in line with the others. Her arms rose, the wooden joints creaking with each movement as she twirled around the room. It was beautiful in a horrifying way, a dance of endless empty souls bound together by the strings of the house, forced to move in perfect synchrony. She could feel herself slipping further away, her thoughts clouded, her consciousness fading into the background. The house was winning. It was too late. Her eyes flicked to the cracked mirror once more. The reflection staring back at her wasn't just a puppet. It was an empty shell, hollow and cold, a figure lost in a dance that never ended. The woman she had been was gone. There was nothing left but the puppet she had become. And still, the dance continued. But then, something changed. A sharp crack echoed through the room. One of the puppets, the one without eyes, jerked violently, its wooden limbs snapping out of alignment. It wasn't supposed to move like this. It wasn't part of the synchronized waltz. Charlotte felt a surge of panic, an instinctual push to move away from the puppet, but her body refused to obey. The puppet's body twisted, and its arms reached out, not in the slow, controlled manner it had before. This was different. It was alive, and it was angry. The other puppets turned in unison, their glass eyes narrowing, their heads tilting, as if acknowledging the dissonance in the dance. The walls groaned, and the house seemed to shift, bending under the strain. Charlotte's body froze. Her strings were pulling in every direction, tearing her apart from the inside. She could feel it, the breaking. The house's grip was slipping. The other puppets were watching, waiting for her to move, to join the dance once more. But it was too late. The puppet with no eyes reached for her, its twisted hand curling around her wrist, pulling her forward. Charlotte gasped, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She wanted to scream, to break free, but the puppet's hand clamped down on her arm with unrelenting force. No more dance, no more movement. Her body snapped out of the puppet's grip, but not because she had broken free. It was the house, pulling her back into its grip. Her limbs twisted at odd angles, her joints cracking and snapping as the strings of the house yanked her towards the center of the room. Charlotte fell to the ground, her face pressed into the cold, rotting wood of the floor. The puppets gathered around her now, their eyes fixed on her as she lay there, helpless. She wanted to scream, but there was no voice. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't move. All she could do was watch as the house took its final hold on her. The puppet without eyes loomed over her, its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. Charlotte felt the cold fingers press against her forehead, the final touch that sealed her fate. The house had won. The walls groaned once more, louder now, as if they were celebrating their victory. The shadows in the room stretched out, curling around her, dragging her deeper into the dark. She felt her vision blur, her senses slipping away as the last fragments of her identity were consumed by the house. The puppets surrounded her, their eyes glistening with hunger, their wooden limbs reaching for her, pulling her into the dark void. And in the final moments, Charlotte understood. The house never let go. It was never finished with its victims. It had taken her, just as it had taken all the others before her. The dance would continue, forever. And as the last vestiges of her consciousness faded, she realized with sickening clarity, she was never meant to leave. She was just another puppet, another soul to join the endless, twisted dance of the house. And it would never end. The darkness enveloped her completely, suffocating and thick, as though the very air was alive and pressing against her, hungry. Charlotte's mind was a fragile thing now, barely a whisper of what it had been before. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts fraying at the edges, fading into the blackness that surrounded her. Her body, once her own, had long since stopped obeying her. The puppets were there, watching her, their glass eyes gleaming with an eerie intensity, locked onto her with their unblinking stare. She could hear their soft wooden creaks, their limbs moving in slow, deliberate motions. But the dance had ended. It was time for something else now. Charlotte's heart thudded against her chest, but it was weak, faint. The house was swallowing her alive, piece by piece, as she lay motionless on the cold floor. The strings had pulled taut, pulling every last shred of her being toward the center, toward the dark heart of the house. The warmth in her body was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness that sank deep into her bones. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to scream, to claw her way back to life. But the will was gone. She had become part of the house, its walls, its shadows, its puppets. Her eyes fluttered open, and what she saw was worse than anything she had imagined. The mansion was no longer just a building. It was alive, a breathing, pulsing entity. The floors beneath her trembled as though the house itself was shaking, its walls groaning in unholy pleasure. The puppet stood frozen, surrounding her, watching in silence as the house took its final claim. Charlotte's breath grew shallow, her vision narrowing to a single point, the broken mirror that had started this nightmare. She could see her reflection, or rather, what she had become. Her face was twisted, hollowed out, eyes lifeless, just like the puppets that now stood guard around her. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. She had no voice left. The puppets weren't moving anymore. They were waiting. Her body twitched, a final, involuntary spasm, but it wasn't her. It was the house, pulling the last traces of her being into its depths. The wooden fingers of the puppets reached out once more, their cold, unmoving hands taking her by the shoulders, lifting her from the floor. She could feel them, those same unfeeling hands lifting her up, carrying her toward the center of the room. And then, the final change. The puppet with no eyes, the one that had been the first to move, stepped forward. It was the leader, the one that controlled them all, its cold fingers traced along her face, like the fingers of death itself, its touch colder than any ice. The room spun, the shadows thickening. The house was humming now, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls. The walls closed in, the ceiling groaning as though it were about to collapse on her. But Charlotte didn't scream. She didn't struggle. There was nothing left of her to fight. The last spark of life had been extinguished. She was gone. Her body became still in their grip, her limbs frozen in place. The house had taken her soul completely, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The final echo rang out, the last breath of a soul lost to the house. And then, everything went silent. The puppets stood still, their glass eyes now voids, just like hers. The room returned to its suffocating silence, the hum of the house dying down to a whisper. Charlotte was gone. The mansion was still. The house had won. And the cycle would begin again. The puppets waited. They were always waiting. For the next soul to walk through the door, the next lost victim to claim. And the house would never be empty. It would never stop.